My name is Carolina Garcia Jayaram, and I have the distinct pleasure of wrapping up this whole day for you in one very quick session. So, even though my mind is still reeling from all of the incredible things that we've heard today in the conversations, I've tried to boil it down and synthesize down to a few things that I think are important to hear specifically from the artists. And I am currently in the role of CEO of the National Young Arts Foundation, headquartered in Miami. Our charge has been for 35 years now to identify and support young artists, the next generation of artists who will one day be sitting on this dais here, speaking hopefully to people much further down the pike of progress, I hope. So I'm very happy to be in that position. I'm very happy to be here with all of you today. I've devoted my whole career to helping artists and to working with individual artists, and not only to helping them make the work they want to make, but also to be in positions of power and to speak to Darren's point of trying to break the patterns that either ensure justice or injustice, which I thought was a really poignant way of putting it. So often in conferences like this, we're talking about artists, but they aren't in the rooms, with us, and definitely not in moments like this and being able to speak to us at the same time. So I'm really grateful for the way that this day was set up by Teresita and Olga, and I'm glad to be closing it out. So I wanted to start with, there's so many incredible things that were said today, but one thing that, hang on, now I lost my place. My notes are all over. Oh, that Arlinda Davila started with, that I'd like to talk about, is this idea of the lack of patrons leading to the lack of data on value, and that without the agreed upon value, there's a lack of access to the market, which then without the lack of access to the market, again, keeps us from the work from being valued, this sort of like total cyclical system of value and measurement and who's doing it and the access to the market and the patrons. And it was all a very interesting way of thinking about measurement from the artist's point of view. And my question is, how has that data or lack of data around market value, let's talk about it that way specifically first, how has that affected your ability to make the work you want to make that isn't necessarily able to be measured in that way or valued or sold in that way in the marketplace, to get it to the public beyond the marketplace and to be able to live as artists, to make a living as artists? So it's a big question, but I know it's different for each of you, so that's why I wanted to kind of be general enough that it could affect the way each of you practice. And we can start just right next to me.
Is this on? Okay. I have to say, as the more elder member of the panel, and someone who makes a form of art that is not really very commercial or consumable in any way in the marketplace. I'm 73 now. I have maybe, in terms of the big pieces, sold 4 in my lifetime, usually to museums. Never had a retrospective, never had a book, and I guess never made a living as an artist, but made a living as an advocate, as an educator. But the thing I really wanted to say, and it's not particular to me, is this idea that we're here today talking about equity, access, citing historical paradigms we know about. We're in this room with some of the most important people that have influence on that. But we're not talking about the entirety of the system. And by that I mean the market system and how it's driven. The rise of the art fairs, the power of the auction houses, the relationship between scholarship, art historical departments, advisors to galleries, members of committees at museums that sit on acquisitions. All of these things are part of an enormous marketplace that defines what is consumable, what is collectible. And so I'm speaking as a Chicana. My comadre Judy Bach is here with me. Many of us are here today. We have occupied a space for many, many years that was not part of a marketplace. And in fact, we began making art as a counterpoint to the marketplace, as an anti-elite practice, as a community-driven form of expression. Then somewhere along the line, people found us, discovered us, and we moved into the marketplace, some of us, but never very comfortably. So when you ask about data and data-driven, I think, in fact, it really has to do with how the artwork can be quantified. And so if you do work that's engaged in community, there's a lot of language now about social practice, about engaged art. I mean, Kermit Weems, who is one of the fellows here at Ford, we had a gathering in January talking about that, trying to prepare the next generation of activist artists to move forward. So the question then, I think, is really not so much about data and how things are sold and bought, but really in what way does the art we make have a place in such a system? Not just by nature of whether it's public or private, whether it's installation, whether it's video. It really has to do with what it represents as an experience and whether that experience is quantifiable and valuable in a system driven in the way that it is by such large market forces, hedge fund people, collectors. It's so complicated that I think the artist stands really in a very unique position, sometimes overpowered by such a system, and sometimes able to respond and find ways. I had a gallery for a brief period of time, but I wasn't suited to a gallery. Not because Bernice Steinman wasn't a good gallerist. I just wasn't the right kind of artist. And I think that may be true for yet another generation of Chicanos, at least, and some Latinos that really make work that lives in sort of Nepantla, the interstitial space between two worlds. And that's the world of the market and the world of the community. So I don't know that very long-winded to say that I have no way to know what that marketplace is like, since I've only dipped into it once in a blue moon, and that was because the Smithsonian screwed up, and my friend Alicia Gonzalez caught them, and they wrote a report called Willful Neglect, and then they started an initiative, and therefore the Smithsonian bought my Dolores Del Rio piece in 1995, because really, they only buy us when they have to. And so I'm as happy they had to, because they should clean it up. But I will leave it to my younger colleagues, so I think maybe I have a better understanding of that market. But I just wanted to situate that a little bit.
Thank you. And if you don't have an answer for this, no pressure to answer it, just if it's something you want to speak to.
I guess even being sort of in the marketplace, it's still sort of a mystery to me in a lot of ways. I mean, I perceive myself, my perception of my career in a sense is that I'm sort of in the room, but I'm like that's sort of, I'm in the room. I don't know, I'm not on stage, but I'm in the room, except for here, of course. But, I guess I've had, anecdotally, a number of things. A wonderful curator from the Weatherspoon once told me, in putting my work up for acquisition there, that, everybody said, well, we already have a Carrie Jones Marshall. Why do we need this? So which I think speaks to the notion of how do institutions think about diversity within diversity, this kind of, I think maybe Lisa brought it up, this kind of idea of a top or a one or a sort of thing like that, but could we broaden conversations? And I admittedly make kind of weird work. It's figurative, it's narrative, but it's not necessarily admired in a sort of outward, politic, necessarily, and it's also not like social practice work either, and it's not connected to a sort of project-based, just paintings, and it's not necessarily connected to project-based work. So as I see a lot of funding and around art go more towards those large project-based things, which I can totally understand that calls a lot of funding. I sort of see my practice as being a little bit sort of outside of that, and so I do, while I'm well within the market, sustaining myself as an artist, right, is like a sort of is touch and go, and I teach, and teaching's great. I like, and so I'm able to sort of sustain myself as an artist because of a sort of a combination of sort of things, and not be heavily reliant on the market.
It's kind of a strange question for me to answer. I mean, I definitely acknowledge that I feel fortunate that I'm one of the fortunate ones. I'm one of the lucky ones who has spent already an entire life supporting myself off of my work, and solely my work. I make extremely large-scale work. That's strike one. I definitely depict very difficult imagery that at times is very confrontational and difficult to wake up with in the morning. Strike two. So I'm one strike away. But I think that it really, I made the choice and promised myself a very long time ago, once I got out of school, after I displayed that Zoot Suit Riot painting, I knew what I was making the work for. And I was caught in the tail end where I felt like in the late 90s, I caught the very tail end of sort of the old guard, the old school. I was fortunate enough to experience life before the internet and before the art fairs and like the art world just really exploded. But I also got to see all of that go from 0 to 100, right, in the past 15 years or so. And so when I was in school, there was no discussion about the market and how to talk to curators and how to promote yourself and how to build a website. None of that stuff mattered. I spent 2013 through 15 helping to design the curriculum and to launch the first art school in the state of Texas, right? In the year 2016, there's never been a 4-year program devoted to making art and creating, right? And so we launched that in San Antonio, and I served as chair of the department for a year, and then I stepped down and said, this isn't for me. I mean, I knew it was time to go when I was daydreaming out my office window because I wanted to be in the studio. And so then I spent another year or two teaching, and I loved working with young artists. But I really had a difficult time with it because I would come home and I was exhausted, but I felt exhausted and really sort of, not in terms of a physical sense, but mentally I was really questioning my role as an instructor because there's such an obsession with the market. 18-year-old, 19-year-old young minds are so obsessed with making it, and it created such a conflict for me because I felt many times like at the end of the day I wasn't sure what my role was exactly as an instructor. I wasn't sure how I was supposed to accommodate the school who was trying to become accredited, so therefore I had to cover these sort of bases. I didn't really feel like I had room to teach that a very important part of your practice as a painter in the studio is learning to just stare at the wall, right? And to daydream, because in many ways that teaches you as much as learning any kind of technique. And so I'm back in the studio, and I think that with the work, again, I've been fortunate enough to move the work to where I couldn't make it fast enough. I wish that I could order another pair of hands on Amazon to help me out. But I think that it's a lot of work to really continue to remind myself and insist that I turn that light switch off, right? Especially when making this work. There's no guarantee either that that's going to not run out at some point.
So I relate to a lot of what Amalia brought up a little while ago. I'm from Chicago, as you know, and sort of the way that I started getting engaged in art was through sort of a community effort. And it was sort of the kind of process where, you work with what you have, you make it work, you make it, wonderful in some kind of way. So the everyday would become something unique or special. And so when I got to undergrad, as a painting major, I was told that I actually belonged in illustration because I wanted to tell stories. I didn't belong in painting. All of my instructors were, ab-ex painters. So I always had this feeling of discomfort, all along. And so when I returned to Chicago and continued, making my work, it started to become much more around organizing and creating artistic interventions in public space, and that is not easy to sell, as you know. So I actually never sell work. I do make objects, I do make installations, but maybe I've sold a piece. I don't really even remember. And I think I'm okay with that. I think there's also just different kinds of markets. I think about teaching at an academic institution as a form of marketing. I've been lucky to have recently some foundation grants, and that has, substantially, funded some major community projects. And but I think for me, it's about how do I sort of balance the fine line between having funding to support work, but at the same time, making sure that it's meaningful and it's still relevant to people, because it's so much about participation and working with others. So for me, that is a constant balance.
Yeah, I think one of the many tensions of today has been this issue of the many art worlds, and how many art worlds can we possibly talk about in one day, in one conversation, let alone one wrap up here, as I'm being told to wrap up quickly. But I'm going to do a couple more questions unless anyone really wants to stop us. But I feel like we should hear from the artists at the end of all of this. I think it's really important that we hear your point of view after everything we've heard today. But this idea of the many art worlds and who's putting value, and I don't think that that she was wrong in saying it starts in some realms of that art world with the patron, right? Saying what the value is, and the museum's following what the value is based on group shows turning into solo shows, turning into reviews or whatever, critical reviews or whatever what have you. And that I think it's fascinating that artists have found other ways to mark value, in the community or through getting foundation support or other ways of making that don't depend on that value system. You're going to make the art, you're going to make the work, regardless of who's setting the value, right? But what I'm curious about, because so much of the conversation today has been about that art world in museums, what do you feel, if any of you have something to say about this, about the role of artists in the museum, not in the hanging in the museum, but in the activation of the museum, in the administration of the museum? We know there's a lot of artists working in museums, but even on the boards, and Adam spoke to this earlier, I don't know if he was talking about artists on the board, but I see this all the time of artists being on the board, but not really having the power of other trustees on the board. And if it is a real give-get, if we can really get to that point of give-get, meaning artists can be on the board and have the equal amount of powers as trustees who are bringing in millions of dollars, what would that look like? But anyway, my question to you is, do any of you have a feeling about that or thoughts about that, about what artists can do in museums, just specifically because that's been so much of the conversation today?
I guess I can say this is that, given that there's such a wide range of institutions here, and, to somebody's point that I think the Vincent Price Museum is talking about how sort of finite the sort of space of a sort of history-oriented museum it is, and getting those oral stories or recordings. And I think maybe that's something that artists offers, that it's like on the ground. Like, when I think about being a young artist in 2004, being at the Studio Museum in Harlem, and who was around me and what was going on sort of at that moment, it's sort of like not really reflected by what I see in terms of, a sort of market valuation of kind of, generationally or whatever. Mm-hmm. So it depends on, sort of, I think depending on the conversations that, museums or institutions want to have, I think that a lot of times artists can sort of provide a little more of a micro sort of understanding, of what's happening within the arts community at any time.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I've seen more and more artists joining boards, which I find very promising, and I hope that continues. I'm not sure.
Mainstream museums, or are you meaning ethnic museums? Because we've always.
I know. No, I know there's always been board leadership, but I guess in the administration of the board, I'm just wondering, I guess the bigger question is where in the conversation are artists in in this value system and making these decisions? Do you feel a presence there? Do you want a presence there more than has been in the past? Do you think that would help move the needle further, in other words?
Yeah, but yeah. I mean, I haven't been asked to be on the board, so
Yeah.
I don't know what goes on in the room, but I think that, yeah, you know. But it seems, I guess, it seems more what I see in relationship to that question and to the question and the sort of, and the reality is that you, a lot of times artists are asked to come into the institution to do something that is dynamic in relationship to the programming or the you know,
Right.
being highly sort of visible for the public and not so much behind the scenes
Right.
decisions.
Maybe this isn't the right question. Maybe the best question to sort of end this with is what you feel, each of you, would be the best call to action, you know, from the artist point of view to a group like this. There, now, that was the right question. Okay, good. You know, what is it you want to see happen? And try to keep it brief a little bit so that everybody can speak, because I know we want to wrap this up, but I think it's really important for us all to have that be the final thought, is from all of you what you think needs to happen next.
Okay, I'm going to say something that it's actually a quote from Kwame Anthony Appiah. I was lucky enough to be in a think tank with him once, and he told me that at that time you could not fly from the west coast of Africa to the east coast of Africa, this is post-colonial, without going through a mainstream airport in Europe, like London or Paris. And so we joked about it being a white airport, and I said, well, you know, education institutions like the museums, they're white airports. And they're white airports because we cannot know each other without passing through that airport. So part of our job, I think, is to avoid that airport, and if we have to drive our cars or whatever we do, we have to find more ways to broker our own structures of activism and alliance as we go forward in this. Because if we go hand in hand, we're constantly going to hit the same wall. I mean, I wasn't joking when I did those postcards. This has been going on from really the 50s on. So if change is going to happen, and that's the question you have, I think it has to be aimed directly at structural change, policy change, and we as artists will figure out our way to win through that. But we have to form our own alliances in order to do that. And that's what Teresita has given us today. She's given us a forum for beginning to talk to one another about how we might structure our activism. And I think before we leave here today, we should have some commitments from institutional bodies that we will move forward in either another gathering or some way in which action will happen. Discussion is not action, and we discuss and we talk and we perform. I used to call myself a sort of Chicana court jester because for years I performed at museums. Whenever they wanted to know, they wanted to know, they wanted to know, and then when it was over, nothing changed. So I think that we've got to know when we leave this room today that something will happen. Whether we decide to do it on our own, whatever we identify as the structural pressure points, they have to be decided.
I mean, I think I'll go simple. I think one thing that artists can do is curate exhibitions. I think it's crucial that artists steward the conversation around art and not leave it up to everybody else to do it and just try to get into the show.
I've got a simple answer too. Education. Education is key. And of course, I mean education in the traditional sense, you know, degrees and sitting in a classroom. But this is education, right? Educating boards of institutions on the importance of diversifying those boards, right? Educating young people into understanding that they too should be committed in investing their funds or their money when they grow up into young adults, that purchasing a piece of art is as satisfying, as rewarding as purchasing a ticket to a football game, right? I think this is one of the big issues in communities of color. In my own community in San Antonio, you know, you'd be amazed at how much people will spend on commodities, but when it comes to art, they look at you like, man, you smoking something. I'm not paying that much for a piece of paper, right? Education is always, will forever be the key. The more that we speak about these things, the more that we share these experiences, the more and the quicker things will begin to change.
I want to kind of give a shout out to two people. Koya Paz is a director of Free Street Theater in Chicago, and she's just this really amazing kind of radical theater educator. And one of the things that she talked about, I think maybe Thelma touched on earlier, was about how important it is that the large institutions don't take away funding from smaller grassroots institutions, because everybody's sort of clamoring for sometimes the same funds. So where that allyship happens, where you recognize the work, the histories that have already been made, the work that's been going on for, since you said 50s maybe, right, for a long time. And so how do you give homage to that work and giving it a platform rather than sort of taking that away? And the other person is somebody named Mariam Kaba, who runs a project called Project Nia. She just recently moved to New York City from Chicago, but she's a juvenile justice leader. And, sometimes when I'm doing my work, I'm thinking, I don't know if being an artist is enough. Like maybe I should be doing something else. Like, should I be involved in, I don't know, policy? I mean, I wouldn't be a good policy person, right? But I think about those things, especially in these urgent times. But what I love about what Mariam says, who, is a big supporter of the arts, is, no matter what you do, whatever it is you do, whether you're an educator or, you work at a bank, whatever it is that you do, that each of us has a responsibility for a radical transformation, no matter what it is. And that kind of gives me a lot of energy and excitement and, humbles me.
That's a great note to end on, some radical transformation. Thank you all so much. Thank you so much.